cognitive learning theory. The first principle is the redundancy principle. Many multimedia presentations involve a combination of spoken words and on-screen text graphics. However, the redundancy principle suggests that multimedia messages are most effective when learners encounter just spoken words and graphics. When instructors include text on screen, they risk overwhelming their learners' visual channels with bold pictures and words, and inadvertently direct their cognitive processes through solving differences between the spoken text and the printed text. To address this principle, when delivering a narrated presentation, use either graphics or text, but not both. Second, minimize the use of text during a narrated presentation. The second principle is the coherence principle. The coherence principle is about minimizing extraneous processing. Instructors should not include information in their multimedia messages that will not be assessed. Is merely intended to spice up the presentation or distracts from learning goals overall. Mayer also warns against including seductive details that the presenter might include to re-engage the audience or create emotional responses which the audience often retains better than the intended core messages. Given that learning is an active process, these extraneous details may interfere with learners' construction of mental models to represent the material. To address the principle, include only graphics, text, narration that support learning goals. Don't use decorative images or supplemental materials. Don't use background music, and use simple visuals. The third is the signaling principle. Particularly when multiple pieces of information are on screen, learners need to know what to pay attention to, where they are in the presentation, and how to integrate the information to construct their own mental models. Accordingly, the signaling principle recommends that instructors add cues that direct learners' attention to salient material. Mayer is careful to point out that this can be overdone, so presenters should use signals sparingly. To address this principle, use nalos, highlightings, and other signals to draw attention to important information. Include an advanced organizer and refer back to it when you advance to the next section. The fourth principle is spatial contiguity principle. The specifics of the spatial contiguity principle may be somewhat more intuitive than Mayer's other principles. In short, it suggests that instructors should keep text near to the graphics that they describe. If they do so, they minimize the cognitive effort that learners must expand to align the meaning of text and images themselves. Thus, instead of scanning the screen to make such connections, learners can devote their cognitive effort to integration and connection building. To address this principle, place text in close proximity with the graphics it refers to. Provide feedback close to the questions or answers it refers to. Present directions on the same screen as an activity. Have people read any text before beginning an animated graphic. The fifth principle is the temporal contiguity principle. To maximize learning, the temporal contiguity principle dictates that narration and animation should be delivered concurrently. For example, students should hear about a process and then watch an animation of it afterward. Instead, instructors should time the narration to play along with the animation. To address this principle, time narration appropriately to play along with animations. The sixth principle is the segmenting principle. Mayer's experiment involved presenting asynchronous multimedia messages to research subjects. He determined that when students had the ability to control the pace of the lesson, they performed better on recall and transfer tests. Thus, the segmenting principle has two implications. First is users should have control over the pace of the multimedia lesson, and second, instructors should chunk material appropriately to allow for adequate processing on each slide or screen. To address this principle, allow users to control the pace of the lesson, such as speed, controls, or next buttons. Second, break down long segments of material into smaller pieces. The seventh principle is the pre-training principle. The necessity of managing essential load suggests that it's easy to novice learners to become overwhelmed by the quantity or complexity of the information in a multimedia message. The pre-training principle accordingly recommends that instructors define key terms or concepts before diving into descriptions of processes. Otherwise, students will be stuck trying to learn a process component parts while also attempting to build a mental model of the process itself, which may hinder learning. In essence, pre-training is about scaffolding learning and helping students establish appropriate prior knowledge before beginning a multimedia lesson. To address this principle, define key terms such as names, definitions, locations, and characteristics before beginning a process-based presentation, either in a separate presentation, handout, or similar material. Ensure people know how to use a tool before asking them to perform learning activities within it. The eighth model is the modality principle. The dual channel and limited capacity assumptions lead in part to modality principle, which recommends that instructors use narration instead of on-screen text when pictures are presented. If multimedia messages contain pictures and on-screen text, the combination may overwhelm learners' visual channels. Instead, instructors should only speak words, which spreads the load across both the visual and the verbal channels. To address this principle during a narrated presentation with graphics, avoid using on-screen text unless list key steps, provide directions, provide references, and present important information to non-native English speakers. The ninth principle is the multimedia principle. You could argue that the multiple media principle is starting point for all the other principles, given that it indicates the learners perform better when exposed to words and pictures rather than just words. Given that multimedia presentations may or may not be narrated, it's important to underscore the words in this case should be either printed or spoken, but not both. Effectively leveraging pictures and words together fosters generative processing. To address this principle, include images to illustrate key points, ensure that all images enhance or clarify meaning, and favor static images over animations. And the last principle is the personalization principle. According to this principle, having a more relaxed tone in an online class can actually positively impact learning. Thus, instructors should avoid stiff academic language and instead use more approachable colloquial language. Try to think of the presentation as one-on-one conversation with each student. Informal language has an effect of creating social cues within the presentation that prime the activation of social response in the learner, such as the commitment to try to make sense out of what the speaker is saying. To address this principle, use contractions, use first and second person words. If using a script, try to make an extemporaneous sounding performance. Use polite speeches. Mayer's overarching thesis that people learn better when you use pictures and words together may be intuitive to many instructors. What may be less intuitive, however, is to maximize the efficacy of multimedia messages based on the specifics of how humans process information during learning. Mayer's theories are a rejection of multimedia learning as knowledge transmission and response strengthening. Instead, the theory embraces a knowledge construction perspective that multimedia learning is a sense-making activity in which the learner seeks to build a coherent mental representation from the presented material. Here are the big takeaways from this theory. When it comes to learning, the human mind is a dual channel. It has a limited capacity and it has active processing system. Instructors should manage their learners' essential processing, optimize their generative processing, and minimize their extraneous processing through thoughtful construction of multimedia presentations. These principles are most applicable when the multimedia messages describe processes and when learners are inexperienced. Clearly, Mayer's multimedia principles provide quite a few guidelines for the design of multimedia presentations. Mayer's theory aligns with contemporary thinking on effective learning, which embraces a constructivist perspective. Students learn most effectively when they have to construct their own knowledge and structures and models As Mayer tells us, instructional design involves not just presenting information, but also presenting it in a way that encourages learners to engage in an appropriate cognitive processing. By following the principles of cognitive theory of multimedia learning, instructors can help ensure that multimedia presentation will enhance students' learning. That would be all. These are my references, and thank you for listening.